And to discuss today's rate cut and the economic climate, I was joined a short time ago by Saul Eslake from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Australia. Saul Eslake, welcome to Lateline.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Now, how much of today's rate cut do you expect to be passed on to mortgage customers?
The honest answer is I don't know, and I don't think anyone outside of the major banks does know at this stage, and it's possible that some of the people within the major banks whose decisions it will be haven't made up their minds yet. There's a longer than usual period between today's meeting, which is on the first day of the month, and the second Friday of the month, which is when ANZ will make its decision. That's 10 days away, and the other banks may well, as they have done in other recent months, wait to see what ANZ does before deciding what they're going to do.
Now, the opposition has long argued that government debt is putting upward pressure on interest rates. Is there a connection at all between the two?
If there is, it's a pretty tenuous one. After all, most other Western economies have an awful lot more government debt than we do. I mean, we'll get an update next week on Australia's public debt outlook, but on the latest available figures published by the IMF last month, Australia's general government public sector debt, that is excluding the debt of state-owned enterprises, is going to peak in 2013 at about 9.3% of GDP. Now, the average Western economy's public debt is going to peak sometime later than that at over 100% of GDP, and yet nearly all of those economies have substantially lower interest rates than we do.
Now, returning to surplus will involve the biggest fiscal contraction in Australia in at least 60 years. Was there an economic imperative that the government achieve this surplus so quickly?
Personally, I don't think there is. All of this focus has been on the underlying budget balance, and the underlying budget balance, so-called, is a somewhat artificial construct that was invented by Peter Costello with the honourable motive of ensuring that the decisions which his government was making and the efforts he were making to return the budget to a sustainable position weren't disguised by the sales of shares in Telstra. So he used to distinguish between the headline budget balance, which was the sum of all the goings in and the goings out, and the underlying balance, which excluded the proceeds of asset sales like shares in Telstra. This government doesn't do any asset sales, but what it has been doing has been paying for the rollout of the national broadband network, not through the Department of Communications, but rather by subscribing to shares in NBN Co, and that is not treated as part of the underlying budget. It's a wedge between the underlying and the headline budget. More recently, the government's financing of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the so-called Green Bank, also gets into this wedge between the underlying and headline budget balance, so that although nobody seems to have noticed, while the government is determined to return the so-called underlying budget balance to a surplus in the coming financial year, the headline budget is still going to be in deficit all the way out to 2014, 15 and beyond. And
by how much?
As I say, well, on most recent forecasts by, I think, of the order of $1.5 billion or more, and by $6 billion on the most recent forecasts in the 2012-13 fiscal year. So if the government was paying for the NBN through Stephen Conroy's department, rather than by subscribing to shares in Mike Quigley's company, then it would be an even bigger task again to have the budget in surplus. But we've all been trained over the last 12 years or so to focus on the so-called underlying balance rather than the headline balance, which is what in every other country would be the focus of public attention.
So it's a bit of an artificial surplus we're likely to see next week, is that what you're saying?
It could be. I mean, it depends on what numbers Wayne Swan ultimately produces when he delivers his speech on budget night. And, of course, all we will know on budget night is that he's projecting a budget surplus. It could well be, if revenues are downgraded again, which they have been in each of the last 2 years, or if, for example, the mining resources rent tax collects less than the government is projecting, it could well be that we end up in deficit by the time the final numbers for 2012-13 are brought down. Of course, another luxury the government has is that it doesn't have to present the final numbers for the 2012-13 year until the 30th of September 2013, and if the government runs its full term, it could well be that the election is held before that final number is published.
And we know that the compensation for the carbon tax will be paid in the year before 2012-13. It's been brought forward. Will that have an impact on the surplus figure in 2012-13?
No, it won't, and that's one of a number of things the government has been doing to make the task of getting a surplus by 2012-13 easier. Similarly, the government has brought forward $1 billion of assistance to Queensland for reconstruction from last year's floods and cyclones that will be spent by Queensland in 2012-13, but will be paid by the federal government to Queensland in the last few weeks of 2011-12. And there are various other numbers around expenditure that's been shuffled out of 2012-13 either into the current financial year or into 2013-14, and similarly revenue that's been pushed out of this financial year or 2013-14 into 2012-13 in order to make 2012-13 look better. Now, I think that's a bit silly. I've described it as accounting chicanery. It doesn't do any harm. It doesn't have any adverse impact on the economy. To me, what it underscores is that the objective of having a budget surplus by 2012-13 is more of a political objective, and it's not for me to say that it's an illegitimate one, but it's more of a political objective than it is an absolute dictate of good economic management.
We'll have to leave it there, Saul Eslake. Thank you very much for joining us.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.